The Supreme Court strikes down the ATF's bump stock ban. Plus, Colorado voters are set to vote on a new gun tax this November. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. The Reload, of course, is where you can go to sign up for a free newsletter to stay up to date on all things going on in guns in America every week. And this week, we have some big news because the Supreme Court finally delivered its first gun-related case decision, not a Second Amendment decision, but a gun-related case, and that is on the Trump-era bump stock ban, where a 6-3 court found that the bump stock ban was unlawful. So if you want to dive into what you wrote when you covered the piece, Stephen.
Yeah, certainly. I guess it's the second gun-related case, right? If you count the NRA, I mean, that was about their advocacy for gun rights. It was a First Amendment case.
Right.
This is a more direct, like, gun regulation case, right? This was a ban on, and it really was, when we say ban, this is a total ban. The bump stock ban was a total ban. You could no longer possess them once the rule went into effect. There was no way to register them or keep them at all. The only options were to destroy them or turn them into the ATF, which, by the way, nobody actually did, according to the ATF. I think they had estimated there's something like 100,000 of them in circulation, and that was like 0.01% were ever actually turned into the ATF. And I don't believe, honestly, that there were ever any federal charges for somebody violating the bump stock ban. So a lot of this is kind of, while it was a super aggressive thing because it's confiscation order, essentially, it's one of those ones that I don't think had any practical real world effect beyond just ending the production and sale of new bump stocks. Certainly had that effect. But yeah, I mean, I don't think people were ever charged with violating this ban, and I don't think anyone has ever used a bump stock in a crime except for the one crime, which of course happened to be one of the worst crimes in American history, the worst mass shooting ever. So yeah, kind of bizarre in that respect, in that these are not common devices used in either everyday crime or mass shootings, but the one time they have been used was, well, Las Vegas shooting, where 58 people were killed, which is, obviously a horrendous use of the device and the technique of bump firing. And I guess that's what we can maybe start off with, because obviously bump stocks, I've been on CNN all day. I've done like 3 different hits, right? And I think it's one thing that even somebody who owns guns or keeps up to date with gun news might not really understand how a bump stock works or what it is or what this case was really about. Because this, as you mentioned, it's not a Second Amendment case. Right? This wasn't about the constitutional right to own bump stocks. In fact, we'll get to some of the implications, especially from an Alito concurrence in this ruling later on, about what it might say about the Second Amendment and Bruin and where the court is headed. But to start off with, it didn't have anything to do with the right of somebody to own a bump stock. Instead, it was about whether or not the ATF overstepped its authority when it reinterpreted the National Firearms Act of 1934 to classify bump stocks or guns equipped with bump stocks as machine guns under that law. And that was a roundabout way of banning their possession, because the National Firearms Act initially, and still does with things like suppressors or short barrel rifles, but initially it was a tax on machine guns and these other firearms and accessories. But then in 1986, the Lautenberg Amendment banned new sales of fully automatic weapons, of machine guns, under the National Firearms Act. So in effect, you can still own machine guns, fully automatic weapons, but they had to have been made and registered before 1986 as a civilian. Law enforcement, there's different rules for, as there always are, for law enforcement or other specialized people with licensing and so forth. But generally speaking, you can't make and sell new machine guns to the public. So every bump stock that was ever made, once the ATF reclassified them as machine guns, instantly became illegal. And the ATF's bizarre contention was that they were actually always illegal, that they just, didn't tell anyone until they sort of changed their mind.
I say, in fact, told them the opposite previously.
Right. Yes, true. They did. And that was actually one of the things that got them in trouble with the court, was that for years and through several administrations, the ATF had classified bump stocks as really nothing, as stocks and unregulated devices under the NFA and the Gun Control Act. So, they did a total 180 in the immediate aftermath of the one crime where this device was used, and then suddenly they were machine guns, right? And that was part of what the court didn't like. But the core of it has to do with how bump stocks actually operate. And a bump stock really, as I alluded to earlier, it just helps you complete the shooting technique, bump firing. And bump firing, this is something the court also noted, bump firing can be done without a bump stock. You can bump fire pretty much any semi-automatic firearm. And the way that it works is you're using, instead of pulling the trigger with your finger, squeezing it with your finger, you put your finger in the way of the trigger, and then you push forward on the gun. And you can do this with handguns as well, but with rifles in many cases, you push forward and you're pushing the trigger into your finger instead of pulling your finger against the trigger to pull it back. And you do this because when the gun recoils then, after the round is fired, the idea is to balance this out, this forward pressure that you're using to push the trigger into your finger with the recoil that comes back, so that you're trying to get just enough recoil from that shot so that it resets the trigger. Because on a semi-automatic firearm, it does some things automatically, right? That's why it's semi-automatic. It will, once you pull the trigger, it drops the hammer and hits the firing pin, or it releases a striker that ignites the primer, which sets off the powder charge inside of the ammunition, which pushes the bullet down the barrel and out the gun. And then the gun will use either the recoil from that action or gas siphoned back to move the action, and it'll cycle to where it'll eject the spent casing, it'll reset the hammer or striker, and then it'll strip a new round off of the magazine in the gun and into the chamber so that it can start the process again. Now, in a fully automatic gun, if you just hold the trigger down, that process will continue to go until you let go of the trigger or you run out of ammunition. In a semi-automatic firearm, however, once the new round is loaded into the chamber, you would have to let go of the trigger and then pull it again. It's because the trigger would need to reset. There's a device inside of the firing group of a semi-automatic gun called a disconnector that disconnects the trigger from this firing mechanism until you release it and then pull it again. So with bump firing, what you're trying to do is modulate that recoil and your forward pressure so that your finger the trigger moves off your finger just enough to reset, and then the forward pressure that you're applying allows you to actuate that trigger again with your stationary finger. If that makes any sense. Hopefully it does. Certainly there's good YouTube videos that break all this stuff down as well. But and a bump stock, so again, you can do this without any sort of assist. People will often do it by putting their finger through the trigger guard and looping it through their belt loop to hold it in place to make the technique a little bit easier to accomplish. You don't even need to do that though. If you just practice at it, you can do it from the shoulder or shoulder level by just practicing that forward motion and keeping your finger still in the same place. Like that's what the technique is. And so bump stock, what it does is help you accomplish that by making it so that you can hold on to the stock, the grip of the gun, and it will slide as the gun moves back and forth. And there's a little ledge you put your finger on. I've fired bump stocks in the past. And then it just makes it a little bit easier, a little bit more controllable to actually accomplish this. Now, what it doesn't do is make, which is the ultimate shortcoming of this sort of firing technique, you can shoot a lot faster than a traditional, pulling of the trigger with your finger. to the point where it's close to fully automatic rate of fire. Of course, this all gets very blurry after a certain point because you can have fully automatic rates of fire that are very low. And, I've shot machine guns that have a very low rate of fire to the point where you might be able to recreate it with, like, a competitive shooter could probably fire at the rate of fire some very slow machine guns do. But regardless, bump firing is really there for people. It's kind of a novelty thing. It's just a fun thing because the issue is you can't really control it. It's very difficult to control, to have any kind of aim fire. This is difficult with fully automatic guns too, to a certain degree, but with bump stocks or bump firing, it really ratchets up the difficulty of having any sort of control over where your rounds are going other than just generally downrange and hopefully not too high. That was certainly my experience when I was shooting it. It's sort of like it's a little bit of fun if you don't have access to fully automatic guns. That's how people use them, just to be clear about it. And the issue in this case is with the definition of machine gun and semi-automatic, because that's mainly what the court ruled on, right? They just found that under federal law, under the National Firearms Act, a machine gun is something that can automatically fire more than one round every time the trigger is, per function of the trigger, right? So per the time that you pull the trigger, if it fires more than one round per trigger pull, it's a fully automatic gun. It's a machine gun under the NFA. And bump stocks just don't work that way. That's just not how it works. That was the conclusion of the court. I think it's also just sort of the factual nature of how a bump stock works, because if you don't actuate that trigger each time you want to fire a round, it's not going to fire anything. What bump firing does and what bump stock helps with is it lets you actuate that trigger, pull that trigger, whatever term you want to use for it, function the trigger much, much faster than you would with just using your finger muscles to do it, if that makes sense.
And that's sort of the rub of why this is so controversial, is something you got to. And I think Justice Thomas, who wrote the majority opinion in this case, kind of summed up succinctly, is that Congress could have regulated machine guns as rate of fire, and then perhaps something equipped with a bump stock, because like you said, it virtually simulates a machine gun or some machine guns. But right, because Congress chose to define a machine gun by firing more than one round by single function of the trigger, like you said, almost just on its face, a bump stock doesn't do that. If you are using the recoil and your forward pressure to do multiple functions of the trigger to sort of approximate machine yes, or automatic fire. And that it was the fatal flaw in this rule, was the attempt to try to pigeonhole or shoehorn rather bump stocks in that definition. And, that's why the ATF is walking away with a rebuke from the Supreme Court.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really not much more complicated than that. Explaining how a bump stock works is probably more complicated than explaining what the court was held in this case. And I think this is what we were expecting. There's a little bit of, you listen to oral arguments and they kept going back to this point of, because even Gorsuch and Barrett kind of made remarks that they were perhaps sympathetic to the idea of banning a bump stock, but that they were concerned that the statutory language didn't actually do that. And Thomas didn't really give away much when he was talking, and neither did Roberts. But I did get the feeling that they were leaning towards that concept of, maybe we would want these banned if we were legislators or something, but it's just not what the text of the law says. This device just doesn't operate that way. And this is something, honestly, that I've thought since the very beginning of all this. I remember being on the call, the press call when they announced this, and kind of laughing out loud when they described this part, because it was like, this is just not how these things work. You're just kind of lying about what they do. You have to actuate that trigger every time a round fires. Now, I understand why somebody who is not, versed in statutory language of the NFA or has a deep technical understanding of firearms and how they operate, and they look at somebody bump firing a gun with a bump stock, and they I think there was the Daily the Daily Show did sort of a segment on this, and so Sonia Sotomayor and the dissent kind of got at this. If it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it's a duck. You can certainly watch somebody firing a bump stock as fast as they possibly can and see that is similar in nature to the rate of fire of someone firing an actual fully automatic machine gun. Maybe not quite to that level, but some of the people who have a lot of experience shooting bump stocks is kind of a weird thing to have. Kind of a weird thing to have. These are sort of novelty items. They were always kind of novelty items. They weren't even. This was something that actually the ATF preferred going this route, the NRA preferred going this route at the time to basically to doing legislation, because legislation can be, for kind of the reasons I just laid out there of the complex nature of this and the difficulty of regulating bump stocks through legislation. They kind of preferred to do it by this rulemaking process so that it would be much more laser focused on just bump stocks and not have these some ancillary effects. Because if you outlaw any device that in theory here, if they're going to do legislation on this, and we have seen, of course, state level legislation on this, and it does raise questions in some of the language in these bills, because they're kind of some of them will go further and talk about outlawing things that increase the rate of fire. Well, I mean, increasing the cyclical rate of a firearm is going to increase its rate of fire, and doing something as simple as like changing out the trigger to have a lighter trigger will increase the cyclical rate and the rate of fire. Technically, now it won't be like what a bump stock does, but it'll increase the rate of fire, right? And so that's where it gets harder. I think the fear among gun rights activists when this all was going down had to do with that. Of course, if I'm going to get into the sort of the political side show here, like it may have made sense at the moment where there was a lot of pressure for legislation on this. It didn't make a lot of sense politically for Donald Trump to follow through on this. Like a year later, he got essentially zero credit from gun control activists for doing this. And it won him a lot of criticism from gun rights activists. That you're more engaged, hardcore gun rights activists, maybe not your average gun owner, but certainly the more engaged people have held this against him all along. And now he's got a loss at the Supreme Court in front of his own justices that he appointed to go along with it. So it's a pretty negative thing all around. Of course, it's also right, not just limited to Donald Trump, right? It's not just going to affect his particular rules, right? You could probably speak to this a little bit, Jake.
Yeah. So you could chalk this up into a long line of decisions where the Supreme Court says, Congress, do your job. You can't do this without Congress doing your job. And this comes as part of a long line of recent gun executive orders that are sort of similar. The one that comes to mind most obviously is Biden's pistol brace rule, where basically by the same exact mechanism takes something that the ATF once said was an unregulated accessory, is totally fine to own, and then sort of retcons at the direction of the president to say, actually, it's always fell under the National Firearms Act. In that case, it's short-barreled rifles, which are also regulated by the same act. And so that you can see very well. There was just a district court vacater of that rule for this along the similar lines. So you could just easily see many of President Biden's gun executive orders meeting some of the same trouble in court because it relies on very similar logic.
Yeah, I mean, Biden, Trump kind of laid the groundwork for this with his bump stock ban, and Biden has really picked up the ball and run it down the field. I don't know if that's mixing metaphors or not, but regardless, like he's doubled down on all of these efforts, and they have a lot of the same weaknesses, especially the pistol brace ban, because like you said, the ATF flip-flopped on that one too, and it's really not clear that how they're reinterpreting the text of the statute actually works. And I don't know that the court is going to think it does either. So it does have implications for Joe Biden's executive actions on pretty much all of them, I think.
Yeah,
the ghost gun one, same thing there, where it was forever they interpreted things one way, and then at the president's request, they've changed their mind. And the only one that maybe has a chance is the gun dealer one, because that actually was accompanied by a change to the law. Now there's still a lot of controversy around whether or not the ATF has interpreted the new law change, the slight wording change properly. But yeah, I can see this having kind of a domino effect for a lot of these ATF rules moving forward. It's hard to imagine that the 6 justices who ruled against the bump stock ban would really change their mind on the pistol brace ban, which is even more wide reaching because like I said earlier, there's maybe 100,000 bump stocks out there. The pistol braces, there's millions of those. So it has a much broader impact on your average gun owner than the bump stock ban ever did. So it's interesting. Although the other thing I wanted to mention too briefly is, I talked about how Gorsuch and Barrett had implied that they might support a ban on bump stocks if it was done properly legislatively. And Alito, although it's interesting, they didn't join Alito in this concurrence. So, that was just some stuff they said in oral arguments, which, you always take that with a grain of salt. But Alito, who's probably the most conservative member of the court, I think people would probably label him that way. Certainly one of the most conservative at the very least. He had a concurrence that basically argued Congress should go ahead and ban bump stocks. That the problem here was the ATF's misinterpretation of the statute. The statute doesn't ban these things, but he's saying that Congress could if it wanted to, which I found very interesting because he wasn't like, oh, here's a bunch of analogs to the founding era of something similar to the bump stock ban or to the National Firearms Act. And that's why Congress could go ahead. They have the power to do this, which is what would seem to be required under Bruin, right? Bruin requires that modern gun regulations have a historical analog, that they be rooted in the history and tradition of firearms regulation around the period when the Second Amendment was adopted. And he doesn't talk about that at all in his concurrence. Instead, he's just saying the ATF overstepped its power, but because they kind of added to what Congress had written, whereas to do it properly, Congress would have to be the ones to add new prohibitions in there. And so I don't know. I thought that spoke pretty poorly for any prospect of the NFA being struck down under Bruin, or any prospect that Bruin is going to remain as sort of I think it's kind of at its platonic ideal if you're a hardcore gun rights advocate, if you're a hardcore Second Amendment advocate, because I can only see them kind of weakening that ruling from here, especially based on what Alito said in this concurrence.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because on its face, this ruling itself is a win for gun rights advocates, obviously, because it's a gun regulation being struck down. But things like that concurrence, some of the hints that were the breadcrumbs that were dropped in the oral argument, strongly suggest that the Supreme Court's not on board with just whole cloth scrapping things like the National Firearms Act or the Hughes Amendment or just all these massive shifts and things that, hardcore, like you said, hardcore Second Amendment advocates think should be done and think that Bruin would necessitate, but I just don't see that happening. And I think this Alito concurrence is just more evidence of that.
Yeah. And I don't think you're surprised by it. I'm not surprised by it. Right.
Right.
Because you can even go back to Heller, and the court has been dropping in dicta indications that it's not really out to try and upend all of the federal gun laws that exist. Yeah. And bans on machine guns in particular were specifically mentioned in Heller. There's a whole part which I think is kind of logically doesn't make a lot of sense, but there's a whole part where they're talking about how, armed resistance to tyranny is not really practical anymore, but that doesn't matter for the purpose of the rights guaranteed in the Second Amendment, and where they talk about bans on M16s being kind of not implicated by Heller. At least they don't specifically say they're constitutional, but that's the implication you get. Now it's a different court today than it was in 2009 when Heller was handed down, but I haven't seen any real indications that the Supreme Court is going to move away from that where they've been on. I mean, you can even look at Bruin itself and look at the concurrence in that case, because they're implying that permitting of some kind, a shall issue permitting at least, is likely constitutional. Right? You've got the concurrence from Roberts and Kavanaugh, which if they switch sides and join with the liberals would be a majority on any particular gun case. So they have a lot of sway there. And, they don't point to any particular historical analog for why shall issue gun carry permitting is constitutional under the Bruin standard. They just kind of say it. And that's kind of what Alito is doing here. He's not pointing to any sort of historical tradition. Now, I imagine they would put it under the dangerous and unusual standard that they've come up with in Heller, the common use. Like bump stocks were never in common use, really. Like I said, 100,000. It's a lot, but it's not like what they were. Handguns, which were tens and tens, hundreds of millions, most likely in the United States, or even stun guns, which were, like a couple 100,000. So they may find that that's not common enough to warrant constitutional protection of the Second Amendment, and they may argue that they're too dangerous as well. So they fit that dangerous and unusual category. That's my guess as to where a case like that would go. This is all very hypothetical and far out because there's no sort of Second Amendment challenge to the bump stock ban. It was just this APA challenge, Administrative Procedures Act challenge, arguing that the ATF exceeded its authority, and the court certainly agreed with that.
Yeah. And I quite frankly just don't even see them taking up a hypothetical machine gun case going forward just to avoid that whole mess. But
certainly not anytime soon. They have so many other things they're going to probably get to first.
Yeah. But as we're coming up on time here, just touching on a few newsletter items really quick. One of them we already hinted at was the pistol brace at the district court level. Biden's pistol brace rule was handed a final judgment where it was vacated. So it's a nationwide vacatur is what they call it. Still haven't seen any. I'm sure the ATF will be filing a notice of appeal in that case. That's what they do when a government regulation is struck down. I haven't seen that notice of that just yet. But that will be something worth keeping an eye on because of what happened with the ghost gun rule, where it kept getting struck down and then stayed. But still big news, and it's sort of in line with the Supreme Court decision we saw. Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see what the court does there too. If they also step into and also what the lower court does if they're going to issue a stay, administrative stay, or not. That was the big issue with the Fifth Circuit and those ghost gun cases. They're like the Fifth Circuit would not issue administrative stays, and the court really seemed to want them to. So
kept ping ponging.
We'll see. We'll see what happens there. But I think like we mentioned that rule is also now under a really heavy suspicion that it probably won't stand either.
Yeah, I think that's right over the long term. And then the other newsletter item really quick comes just from the Colorado Sun here in my home state. We've now gotten to the point where all of the gun control bills that passed this session have been signed into law, 8 of them. And then one of them that we wanted to highlight because it's a bit of an interesting political story is that Colorado actually was the second state this session to pass a state level excise tax on gun and ammunition sales. But because of Colorado's Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, any tax increase in the state must go before the voters. So this November, Colorado voters will get on their ballot the option to join California in passing a special sin tax, essentially, on state gun and ammunition sales.
That'll be a really interesting vote to watch, especially given the last time there was sort of grassroots action on guns in Colorado was after the magazine ban.
Mm-hmm.
And so there haven't been many of these sort of ballot initiatives, right, on gun issues in Colorado, right?
Yeah, no firearm ballot initiatives yet. So this will be an interesting test case. Like you said, 10 years ago, there was grassroots action, and it went really well for gun rights advocates. They actually recalled 2 state lawmakers, and they forced a third to resign. Mm-hmm. But the state has gotten far more progressive in the interim. And so I think it'll be an interesting sort of bellwether of where the state really is when they actually have a gun control measure before them and they can vote. Because we've covered in the past, right? Yeah, gun control measures can be a little unwieldy, I think, and differ from what people expect and how they expect them to go. Yeah. So I think it'll be a fascinating development.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking of. The gun control activists have not fared very well at state level ballot initiatives over the last, recent while here. Even going back to like 2016 in Maine, the universal background check ballot initiative there failed. I believe obviously the Oregon gun control initiative passed, but only just barely. And that's in Oregon. which
Right.
is even more blue than Colorado. And you had a number of pro-gun ballot initiatives on the other hand doing very well, including in Iowa recently, right?
The strict
added,
scrutiny.
I think, extra protections to their constitution for gun. I think there was an interesting one because it was like they were voting on the standard that the courts would have to use in gun related cases. And it was strict scrutiny, which is the highest level of scrutiny for examining gun laws. So that passed pretty overwhelmingly as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Colorado. You know, like you said, it's been trending bluer and bluer over the years. Although it is one of those states where they haven't adopted every big gun law that other, you know, states like California or Massachusetts have. The assault weapons ban being the biggest example of that, at least not yet. And so it'll be that. I bet this vote, if this vote loses, because obviously they must expect it to pass, or they wouldn't have pushed forward with this, right? The governor wouldn't have signed it, and they wouldn't have. If the Democrats thought this wouldn't pass the voters, I would assume they wouldn't have pushed for it. But if it fails, I think that may change the politics there a little bit. We'll see.
Certainly. And it's also a little bit risky because just putting anything gun related on the ballot is almost like a turnout driver for folks that probably won't agree with you if you're a Democrat. Just putting yourself in the mindset of a Democratic politician.
Especially a tax hike, right? Like,
it's taxes and guns, and it's basically just asking people to come to the polls then at that point. Right. People that might not agree with you.
I mean, you know, people don't generally mind putting taxes that they don't think they're going to pay. So maybe we'll see some of that.
That's the countervailing point for sure.
Yeah. But generally speaking, an anti-gun, pro-tax ballot initiative seems like a heavy lift. So if it passes, that'll be interesting. And if it fails, I think it'll be even more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. But we'll stay on top of it as we head into November. I'd be interested to see if they do some polling on it once we get closer to election time, what it's looking like. So and the last thing we wanted to hit is in addition to all your TV hits today, you had a busy day today. You had the NJC Range Day. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I went straight from doing 2 CNN hits this morning to the Range Day for the National Journalism Center, and then right back to CNN, to the studios in DC for a very good interview with Jake Tapper. And so, the Supreme Court was not thinking of me and my schedule when they decided to make this decision today. It's very rude of them. But yes, so I was at the range in my suit that I'm currently wearing now, for anyone listening and not able to watch. Been in the suit all day. It's been a little bit uncomfortable at times, but you do look cooler at the range shooting if you're in a suit, to be honest with you. It does kind of limit motion a little bit, so it makes shooting a little more difficult, but you do look cooler doing it. Anyway, so first of all, the CNN stuff was really good. I thought there were a lot of really smart people commenting on the ruling when I was on, and I was able to make a couple of the key points, some of the stuff that we've talked about here on air. So I was happy about that, just to be able to try and give people a full understanding and explanation of what's going on, and CNN's audience is much larger than ours. So always happy to do that, and glad to have the opportunity. NJC, the National Journalism Center, our Range Day, where I go and teach a bunch of journalism interns about gun reporting, some of the common pitfalls, some of the common terminology, some of the best approaches, things like that. We do a classroom session where we go through, the common things you're going to run into reporting on firearms as a journalist, and try to give them a base level knowledge that they can work with, and hopefully keep them from making mistakes that harm their credibility or hurt their audience's understanding of the issue. And then we give them a safety course as well, a safety briefing. We're doing it at XCal this year in Loudoun County, Virginia. Great facility, great staff. They did a great job handling the safety briefing, and they had a bunch of RSOs on hand who helped walk a lot of these journalists and interns through the shooting process. Many of them have never fired a gun before. This is common in these classes that we do. So they get to go in and actually have the safety briefing and shoot firearms. And we give them a variety, some of the most common guns that come up in news coverage, AR-15s. We have them with suppressors. We've got Glocks, different handguns, revolvers, all that kind of stuff. So they can have a nice variety of shooting, so that just so they can experience it as part of their training, so they can be better informed on the issue. That's the goal of these, and I think they've worked wonderfully, and this one is no exception. I thought it went really well. We had 26 interns, so that was quite a lot for one of these events. Sometimes, different semesters are bigger than the summer semester tends to be the biggest for, I guess, fairly obvious reasons, right? That's when college kids have time to go and do internships. But, it's great whether it's a smaller group or a really big group like this one. And I'm really glad to be able to participate in this and to put it together, and that NJC has embraced the idea and really run with it. So I'll hopefully have some pictures of it in the members newsletter this week, if I can, alongside probably some of those CNN hits, links to that in case people want to watch them as well. So look for that if you're a Reload member, and check it out in this Sunday's newsletter, your exclusive Reload member newsletter that you get every Sunday that only Reload members get, which is perhaps a good reason to become a Reload member. You, of course, will get the interview podcast a day early. But this week we have Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms on the show, by the way. Jake, he's always one of my favorite guests. It's been a long day, as you can see. I can't even talk anymore. But he's on to talk about the Hunter Biden verdict and sort of the politics of that, and also to discuss his exclusive interview with the new NRA CEO, Doug Hamlin. So we get some insight into that, because Cam has been one of the most vocal pro-gun writers and radio show hosts who've criticized the NRA and the misuse of charitable funds there, members' funds. And I think he's been a real leader in that aspect. So it's good to have him on and get his reaction to talking to the new leadership at the NRA and what his take is on it. And I think it's a really interesting one. We may have him write something for the Reload as well, hopefully in the coming days. I'm looking forward to that if he's able to do it. But I think that's what you can look forward to. You'll get it a day early in your members newsletter if you join the Reload. So head on over to thereload.com and check that out today. Before we end here, again, this week we have a sponsorship from The Dispatch, another great publication that I highly recommend to people. I've been a paying member forever. I'm going to have just a little bit message. I'm going to instantly change my clothes and travel back in time to when I recorded this, but take it away, me, from an earlier period in time. That's right. This episode is brought to you by The Dispatch. We're doing one of these classic promo swaps with them, actually on Kevin Williamson's newsletter, which is one that I personally subscribe to and read pretty much every time it comes out. I've actually been a paying subscriber to The Dispatch since they launched. They have over 400,000 readers now. Jonah Goldberg and Steve Hayes and Chris Steyerwalt and Ala Pundit. There's so many people who write over there that I've long followed and respected and enjoyed their perspective. And of course, in addition to a lot of the great commentary that they have from people that you probably know better than me, the people who are more well-known than I, they also have a lot of really deep and original news reporting that they do. And so that's why I've been happy to have them as one of our sponsors, as a promo swap. I would definitely stand behind their work and recommend it to you guys in a way that I couldn't say for a lot of other publications out there. So, if you're interested in checking out The Dispatch, if you haven't heard of it before, or you haven't taken the time to go over and examine what they're bringing into the world from a journalistic standpoint, I think you should do it. And in fact, part of our promo swap includes a 30-day free trial for their paid version. So you'll get access to everything they have for free for 30 days. So you can read it and make up your own mind. Just follow the link in the description here or in our newsletter this week at The Reload. So that honestly, I just do legitimately recommend them. And so I'm glad to do this sort of promo swap because they're one of my favorite publications. And I think you guys will enjoy them if you enjoy what we do here at The Reload. So check out the Dispatch today at the link in our description.
No, the devil